Okay, so I'm doing my project on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I'm interested in this topic because it serves as both the foundation of an environmental win in the second half of the 20th century and something that can be built on to successfully meet the environmental and geopolitical challenges of the 21st century. Here's an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. In this talk, I'll discuss the history of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, including what was happening before the convention was adopted, the process by which the convention came into being, and what the convention does today. I'll also speak to modern developments involving the convention, including competing claims for deep ocean mining rights under the International Seabed Authority and emerging international conflict over sovereign claims over international waters, including recent developments with the Strait of Hormuz. Lastly, I'll recommend changes that need to be made to the convention to make it more resilient and binding when it decided to protect the environment and resolve conflicts in the 21st century. I'll end with takeaways. Anytime I do a presentation, I always include takeaways because we're bombarded with so much information today that it can sometimes be difficult to separate real meaningful content from time better spent elsewhere. So thank you for investing your time in this video, and I hope to make the next few minutes energy well spent. If you take just one thing away from this video, it's that we need a stronger framework of international laws governing the global ocean in order to meet the challenges of the 21st century. That was the biggest finding in my research, and I'll do my best to explain why this is in the video. I can't expect you to care about the ocean if I don't care about the ocean, so I'll briefly speak to the reasons why I care about the ocean. When I go to the beach, seeing the vastness of the ocean helps put my problems I'm working on at the time in perspective. Seeing where the water meets the shore helps me experience wonder and appreciation, as well as meaningful catharsis. If more people visited the ocean, the world would be a less stressed out place. Counterintuitively, in my research, I've found that humans are actually capable of harming something as vast as the ocean, and it's a moral question whether we take steps to protect it or not. Now, before I get into the recent developments associated with the convention, I'd like to talk about a bit of history. Before the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, international waters were subject to the Freedom of the Seas doctrine. This was a 17th century principle, limiting national jurisdiction over the open ocean to a narrow belt of seas surrounding the nation's coastline, leaving international waters completely free. Now you might think, what's wrong with that? It sounds like a good idea. Well, as it turns out, there are a few major things wrong with this rule that made it impossible to maintain beyond a certain point in human development. By the 1800s, whaling fleets operated with impunity. Right whales, bowhead whales, and gray whales were hunted to the brink of extinction. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, steam-powered vessels began using bottom trawling nets. This severely damaged the seafloor and began to wipe out historic fish stocks, including cod populations in the Gulf of Maine and sardines off the Pacific coast. Also, imperialistic trading monopolies were enforced in the open ocean. Colonial powers seized merchant ships from rival nations in open waters, oftentimes leading to wars. Problematically, by the mid-20th century, there began to be extensive territorial claims made by nation-states over the open ocean because of the discovery of oil, gas, and valuable minerals in international waters. Under the existing Freedom of the Seas doctrine, a foreign nation could build an oil rig 4 miles off a country's beach and drain a country's resources. This led to a series of unilateral territorial claims that threatened to spark a new era of global conflict. In 1967, Malta's ambassador to the United Nations called for a set of rules that governed the global ocean beyond national jurisdiction. This set of rules would need to reflect how to govern the technological changes that had altered the relationship of humans to the oceans. This call would result in a 15-year process that would ultimately yield a new set of rules for all ocean areas, all uses of the seas, and all of its resources. In 1982, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was adopted, which represented a constitution for the ocean. This came into force in 1994. The convention itself is quite long. To address all the problems that were going on because the international waters had been completely free, the convention regulated navigational rights, territorial sea limits, economic jurisdiction, resources on the seabed, conservation of living marine resources, protection of the marine environment, marine research, and a binding procedure for the settlement of disputes between states. I'll summarize just 3 parts of the convention to give you a sense of its overarching aims and themes. So, freedom of navigation. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea provides for freedom of navigation by dividing the world's oceans into distinct maritime zones. Holistically, the freedom of navigation is managed through 4 main legal systems: right of innocent passage, which applies to territorial seas; right of transit passage for international straits, right of archipelagic sea lanes passage for island archipelagos, and freedom of navigation for the high seas. Significantly, the Convention says that all ships must enjoy freedom of navigation through international straits. I'll discuss the significance of this later in the talk. A core part of the Convention is protecting the marine environment. Legally, the Convention provides a comprehensive framework for states' obligations regarding marine environmental protection. The most important part of the Convention's sections on the environment is Article 192, which states that states have the general obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. This means that countries need to be proactive in protecting the marine environments instead of simply doing so when it's required by law. It provides for the global and regional cooperation in protecting the marine environment, as well as support for developing states in their preservation of the marine environments. It codifies mitigation of pollution that was rampant before the Convention, and calls for international standards on all pollution of the marine environment from dumping and land-based sources. The Convention creates the International Seabed Authority, which has broad discretionary powers to assess the environmental impacts of seabed mining to prevent significant environmental damage. Significantly, the Convention includes flag state, port state, and coastal state enforcement mechanisms, with safeguards against abuse. If you remember nothing else from this section of the video, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea emphasizes preventing environmental harm before it ever takes place, as well as a higher degree of international cooperation to address the environmental harm that does occur. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea's dispute resolution provisions are particularly relevant today. These state that all member nations must settle their disputes peacefully, but if they cannot reach an agreement on their own, then there is a compulsory dispute settlement mechanism under the Convention. The Convention holds that the first step in any dispute is peaceful resolution between the two states involved. To do this, states are required to swiftly exchange their views through negotiation or other peaceful means. During this process, they can use non-binding third-party assistance, such as conciliation or mediation. If this first step fails to resolve the dispute, then the two states are required to go through a compulsory procedure that results in a binding decision. Before joining the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, a country can choose a legal forum to handle its future disputes. They can choose the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the International Court of Justice at The Hague, a temporary five-member court known as an arbitral tribunal, or a specialized panel known as a special arbitral tribunal. If the two states have chosen different courts, then the dispute is automatically sent to an arbitral tribunal. Once a verdict is reached, it is binding under international law. This is achieved through a combination of treaty law, diplomatic pressure, and domestic courts. Firstly, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea states that any decision rendered by a court or tribunal under the Convention shall be final and shall be complied with by all parties to the dispute. This is how the Convention was written. In practice, however, certain decisions are more enforceable than others because certain tribunal decisions are enforceable within domestic territories of member states and some are not. Nowhere is this more apparent than with the 2016 case between the Philippines and China. Beginning in 2013, China engaged in a massive island-building campaign across 7 coral reef islands in the Spratly Islands. To build these islands, China used heavy dredgers to grind up the living coral reefs. It also pumped millions of tons of sand and silt over the marine structures to create a stable concrete platform on each island. In 2016, the Philippines sued an international court, claiming the process severely damaged the region's fragile ecosystems. China refused to participate in the hearings, so the tribunal that was appointed to the case appointed its own independent marine biologists and coral reef experts to assess the damage to the ecosystems. Based on this independent assessment, the tribunal concluded, in a victory for the Philippines, that China's dredging and land reclamation caused irreparable harm to the marine environment. The tribunal declared that China had permanently destroyed thousands of years of slow-growing, fragile coral reef structures. Throughout this process, there was no way to force China to participate in the tribunal hearings or abide by its eventual ruling. However, where China rejected the ruling on the part of the International Tribunal, that satellite data shows that China halted its reef dredging and island building activities after the tribunal's verdict was handed down. This shows that the decision at least stopped the behavior that was destroying the coral reefs in the area. So why hasn't the US ever ratified the convention? The US hasn't done this because it wants to be able to set its own policy as a superpower, essentially responding to the perceived overreach of the international community into what the US views as its domestic affairs, and because the convention's deep seabed mining regulations, according to the US government, could potentially impede a future avenue of economic growth. The US executive branch voluntarily abides by nearly all the treaty's environmental provisions as international customary law. However, the Senate has repeatedly blocked official ratification because, among other reasons, many senators believe the convention would harm U.S. strategic interests. There are several significant modern developments associated with the convention today. First, Russia started to claim resources on the seabed between the world's most developed nations, in theory governed by the International Seabed Authority under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. In April 2025, however, the U.S. issued an executive order granting American corporations the right to engage in deep-sea mining. As the U.S. is not a formal party to the convention, the move sidesteps the International Seabed Authority's Global Mining Code. This increased the risks of legal and physical confrontation over critical minerals in the seabed, such as cobalt and nickel. Another recent development associated with the convention is that the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea continues to be cited regarding the issues of boundaries separating nations' sovereign waters from international waters. China and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations have agreed to a target date of 2026 to finalize a long-delayed code of conduct to manage maritime disputes. The Philippines, which is taking over the leadership chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is pushing heavily for a legally binding dispute resolution framework compliant with the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. This is separate from the lawsuit the Philippines brought against China over island building in the Spratly Islands in 2016. One of the disputes potentially covered by this framework is China's refusal to abide by the 2016 Permanent Code of Arbitration ruling that invalidated its 9-line claim over 90% of the waters in the South China Sea. China is also actively leveraging its naval and coast guard presence to assert effective control over international waters, using domestic maritime legal updates to counter international pushback. In a separate development regarding the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, Russia is citing Article 234 of the Convention, which allows coastal states to regulate ice-covered waters, to exert total administrative control over the Northern Sea Route. In this image, the Northern Sea Route is the light blue line, extending north of Siberia in the east and extending to the north of Scandinavia and Europe in the west. This has been a point of contention between Russia and Western powers because Western nations have argued that there should be freedom of navigation on the Northern Sea Route. Russia is actively using a provision that limits the environmental damage in its exclusive economic zones to project sovereignty and military control over the Northern Sea Route. At present, both sides are refusing to negotiate over who actually controls the route. Russia continues to enforce domestic veto power over who enters the route using its icebreaker fleet, while the U.S. maintains its own legal right to traverse the Northern Sea Route whenever it deems strategically necessary. An event that has been widely covered in the news is Iran's blockage of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's attempt to unilaterally restrict vessel traffic through the strait have been rejected by Gulf states as violations of international law. Specifically, Gulf states, represented by the Gulf Cooperation Council, have strongly and unequivocally condemned Iran's restrictions on the basis of Part 3 of the Convention of the Law of the Sea, Articles 37 and 38, which state that the right of transit passage, in this case through the Strait of Hormuz, shall not be impeded. Moreover, Article 44 states that there shall be no suspension of transit passage. This means that under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, there should be no reason why Iran has the right to impede navigation of an international trade route. While Gulf states have referred the matter to the UN Security Council, the Council remains deadlocked on the issue and has not been able to enforce the Convention in this real-world situation. A major takeaway from my research is that there seems to be an increasing number of disputes between maritime nations under the Convention in recent years. To strengthen the Convention for the geopolitical challenges of the 21st century, it needs to evolve from a framework that defines maritime rights to one that effectively enforces them. While the Convention is written to have a robust dispute settlement mechanism, in practice, one of the challenges that has arisen while in resolving real international legal conflicts is that maritime powers can simply ignore rulings that have not gone in their favor because international courts do not have enforcement power. At minimum, several adjustments can be made to the Convention to make it both more resilient and significantly more effective at resolving international disputes in the coming decades. First, Article 298 of the Convention allows nations to opt out of compulsory arbitration if the cause of the dispute was related to military and law enforcement activities. This article can be sunsetted. This change should be made because as long as powerful states can claim a dispute was caused by military activity, the Convention cannot readily resolve high-stakes geopolitical conflicts. Secondly, international courts can be equipped with an enforcement mechanism to ensure their rulings are followed. This can include non-military countermeasures, such as suspension of port access, maritime trade privileges, or fishing quotas if a nation has just lost a case and does not comply with the ruling. Thirdly, the UN can implement policies to encourage nations to agree on fair boundaries for maritime jurisdiction. For example, if two nations cannot agree on a boundary line for maritime jurisdiction, the Convention created a joint development zone overseen by a third party. This would prevent the resource revenue from simply going to a country that has seized the area by force, encouraging countries to work together to find a solution. And so, as I said at the beginning, I'll end with takeaways. The Convention stopped much of the abuse that was taking place in the open oceans prior to the mid-20th century. Recent geopolitical tensions have tested the Convention, particularly its mechanism for resolving disputes and its encouragement of the international respect for the rule of law in the oceans. While the convention that was negotiated in 1982 was a good start for providing a set of rules for the global ocean, it needs to be at minimum updated and even potentially replaced to ensure that all the nations of the world abide by those rules in the coming decades. Well, I guess that took a little longer than a few minutes. I hope it wasn't too boring. I found it to be a really rewarding experience going through the research and learning more about the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea so I could explain it to you. I sometimes have the experience where I'm tuning into a video online and I think it's going to be a really interesting video and really good, and it turns out to be really boring. So I hope that was not the experience that you had this time. Thanks. Here are my citations.